All right. Well, welcome everyone to this visual podcast on YouTube. I'm Dr. Greg Kennedy. I am a historian, and I'm also the dean of the Faculty of Arts. I've been at Brandon University just over a year at this point. Previously, I was in New Brunswick at the University of Moncton, and my PhD's at from York University. I'm thrilled to be here today to have a bit of a discussion and an update on some research I'm doing with two assistants. These are undergraduate history students from Durham University in the United Kingdom, and I'll give each of them an opportunity to say a little bit about themselves, their studies to date, and how they ended up at Brandon University. Maybe we'll start with you, Jacob.
Of course. So, hi, I'm Jacob. I'm an incoming finalist, say, at Durham University. I'm a history undergrad, and that's all that I've mainly done throughout my 2 years of study at a bachelor's level so far. Predominantly, I generally tend to focus on sort of African history, but I've got quite a keen interest in defense, foreign policy, and diplomatic affairs. In terms of how I sort of came to Brandon, it was very much sort of, I think, on a whim in the sense of my host university sent out an email asking people to put themselves forward for nominations for this scheme run by a group called MITACS. And I didn't really know too much about the whole GRI initiative at this point in time. But I had a little bit of a look into it and I saw fully funded research opportunity in Canada over summer. And immediately I thought that sounds right up my street. So I kind of just went from there. I nominated myself to be put forward by the university. They approved me. One thing led to another. Um, we had a chat over Zoom, Dr. Kennedy and I, and from there, I ended up in Brandon, beginning research in mid June or so. So here we are.
Awesome. And how about you, Alex?
My name is Alexander. I've just finished my third year of undergraduate study. I do a liberal arts degree with a double major, I suppose you'd say, in history and politics.
Mm.
I also go to Durham, but this past year I've just finished a year abroad that I did in Switzerland at the University of Zurich, where I was doing politics mostly, but also some history and sociology.
Mm.
Um, as soon as I heard about this opportunity to come to Canada last summer, I was hugely excited. And I think that this project appealed to me in particular, really because of the cutting edge nature of the research here. So um, there's no, as of yet, comprehensive history of Canada's Reserve Army
Right.
in existence. And I think the idea of contributing towards I suppose, closing that gap in the existing scholarship, I found hugely appealing. And it's been a fantastic first 4 or 5 weeks here. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing with the project.
Yeah, awesome. So Alex mentioned the title of the project, which is the history of Canada's Reserve Army. And full disclosure, I spent 26 plus years in the Army Reserve. I actually joined as a university student. It's how I paid for university right through my PhD. I got the opportunity to do a lot of things with the Army over the years. Uh, Finished as a colonel, as a brigade commander, so lots of leadership experiences as well, particularly towards the end. And I took my release in 2023. And one of the ways that I wanted to keep up that interest, I've always had an interest for military history, but I'm trained and I'm particularly focused on social history methods. So I'm interested in how do we find out more about the ordinary people who end up in military service, and looking at then at different periods. So as far as, what are we trying to do with this project? It's not just to offer a kind of battlefield survey or do biographies of generals. Those things exist and they're good, they're important, but really looking at more of a bottom-up approach to who are these reservists, militia, volunteers, and other forms of military service. What motivates them to join the army? Why do they stay? Why do they leave? What kind of training? What kind of experiences do they have? and taking this from the early days of New France right up to the war in Afghanistan and the current situation. And indeed, knowing that Canada's army, like all NATO countries, are kind of going through this reflection about, how do we pay for military services? How do we ensure that defense needs are supported by both full-time, part-time capabilities? What are the capabilities that we need to have going forward? And how do we make sure that they can jointly work together? So this is part of the nexus by adding historical perspective of how this has looked in the past. There's kind of a unique Canadian history of how reserve forces, militias, volunteers, etc., have been mobilized, have been used, and demobilized and returned to normal society. So we have been very much focused on the early period of that. And so, Jacob, I'm going to throw you a question. I gave you a rather weighty tome, Louise Deschênes, a famous historian of New France, who has since passed away, actually. But she wrote a book about war and society in New France. So 17th, 18th centuries, what we're talking about. Not only did you read the book and put a report together, you also built a database of the military actions that she had compiled, which included details about regular troops, militias, volunteers, and Indigenous allies. What were some of your key takeaways, particularly about the militia and volunteer forces?
Well, I think when looking at the volunteer and militia forces in this period, it's important to distinguish between the two of them because whilst they are both, I suppose, in some form or another, reserve troops, their motivations and their reasons for serving are completely different. And this is a distinction which Deschênes made in her text. And I think the best way to sort of approach that differentiation is by identifying volunteers as those who, I suppose, have a choice to serve without any sort of coercion, whether that be societal, financial. And through that, you can then sort of understand a bit more about militia life activities, what kinds of things they were getting up to. So yeah, the militias were a compulsory societal institution in New France based out of sort of three main areas, so Quebec, Montreal, and Trois-Rivières. And they at first were quite sort of rudimentary in their nature. However, as you go through the years towards sort of the end of the 1600s, going into 1700, you start to see some organisation in the militias in terms of how they're documented and how they're sort of structured. And you can see that through, I suppose, lower and upper age limits for military service. But they generally took part in kind of non-combat activities. This would be reconnaissance, assisting regulars in miscellaneous taskings, I suppose. And one thing which I suppose is quite unique to the New France context, in the sense of it being a colonial frontier colony, is fort constructions. And this was something that happened quite frequently with the militia forces. And whilst it wasn't necessarily a popular task, it occurred and it was quite necessary to the ways in which the colony defended itself. When you look at the table that you mentioned, about 39% of all personnel were militias or volunteers. So this is
Sizable.
whilst they're not necessarily going over 50%, this is a significant amount of people who aren't necessarily soldiers, but are involved in the sort of military nature of life in New France. And when you break that down even further, you see about 26% or so of individuals are in the militia specifically. Again, that's sort of indicating towards that compulsory nature of service. When you look at the volunteers, however, it gets a bit more nuanced because whilst there are only 2% of individuals who I suppose you could categorize as solely volunteers in their purest sense, there is some ambiguity in the database, which you mentioned, as Deschênes has sort of labelled some individuals as a mix between volunteers and militia, and then naval regulars and militia. And to this point, we're not 100% sure what this really means. However, it's something important to distinguish for any further findings that might come about later down the line.
Right.
But the militias tended to operate in a majority quite a lot of the time. So 12.9% of all entries were militia majorities. And that contrasts the volunteers, which are only 7.6% of majority entries. And I think, again, it kind of shows how integrated the militias were into, I suppose, life. And in the sort of defensive capacity, which we briefly touched upon, you can see it in the regions in which they operated. So they were largely operating in a region which I suppose you could classify as Canada, which was sort of the St. Lawrence River Valley and sort of immediate surrounding areas as a majority area. Acadia, so sort of Nova Scotia, that kind of region, and a lot around the Great Lakes. However, this was less so in a majority and more in a sort of supplementary role with more sort of integrated forces. But the militias, they did face a lot of issues in terms of how they functioned, whether this was people not necessarily wanting to take part, whether it was logistical issues or just a lack of training. So there were sort of three things which I identified in my research on the text, at least. There was a lack of adequate training. There was a lack of sort of equipment as well, and a lack of sort of, I don't want to necessarily say a lack of spirit, but initially there was a sort of lack of desire to be involved apart from when the colony was under sort of direct threat.
Right.
So I think the militias are really quite complex in their nature, and that contrasts a lot to some of the findings that you see about the volunteers. So again, there are a lot less volunteers than militiamen. However, the volunteers were driven, in this case at least, by a financial incentive. So they predominantly operated as, I suppose, maritime volunteers in the Hudson Bay area, raiding and sacking English settlements in Rupert's Land. And this was, again, under sort of pretense of them being paid for their work and being given, basically, I suppose, the spoils of war, which unfortunately they never did receive, just because the lack of regulation for, I suppose, seafaring and sacking of land in this context. So I suppose what you generally see when comparing the two is not only a distinction between why they're serving, but also the kinds of things that they're doing.
Yeah.
So, like combat in the sense of raids and pillaging for the volunteers, rather than the sort of constructive roles that the militia were taking part in. But also even going beyond that and looking at sort of a land versus sea sort of differentiation.
Perfect. There's a lot to unpack there. So
massively.
You did a good job of summarizing some of the main themes. I know for you, Alex, you arrived a little later, and so I've got you primarily working on 19th century conflicts, like the War of 1812, and we've been building a separate database about the participants in the 1870 Red River expedition, which of course came out right here in Manitoba, and at the time when Manitoba was becoming part of Canada. So we've notably been trying to link these soldiers from records of them getting medals and recognition of their service to their census records, so that we can actually kind of reconstitute their lives and know more about who are these people, where are they coming from, where do they settle after their military service, etc. What has stood out to you in the work that you've done so far with this group?
Well, I'd say a major thing that struck me working with the data set is simply the range of people that we've been coming across.
Right.
The diversity in profession, in geography, so where these people settled after their military service, even age. We've had some very young people, as young as 12 or 13,
Right.
but also much older people, as well as the nature of their family unit.
Mm.
And what we've been doing more recently is working with our set of veterans in the data set and following them across censuses so we can get a real sense of the evolution of their life experience over
Right.
time, over decades, actually. And this has been very informative because we get a sense of were they moving around? Did they stay in one place? What's been particularly interesting for me, I think, is looking at their family units
Yeah.
and how that's changed over time, looking at their households. So, you can see decade to decade new children being born. You can see older ones coming of age and leaving home.
Right.
Maybe you see a lodger move in.
Right.
Maybe when the head of the household is getting a bit older, children are moved out. You can almost imagine the kind of thinking here. Maybe they don't want to spend so much time doing manual labor, so they bring in a lodger now that they have this extra space, and it brings in some extra income. But you also, we've come across some real human tragedies. So we've seen children die, go missing from one census to another. So the census data has given us a sense of the real breadth of human experience for these veterans. And I think that's been fascinating. And I suppose last thing I'll mention is that being from the UK, I'm from London, we have been coming across people who fought at Red River who decades later were living in London.
Right.
And for me personally, whenever I come across one of these soldiers who's living in an area that I know quite well today, it's personally, I don't know, it creates this link with the past that I find very illuminating.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that can be challenging with military history, especially when we're focused more on that battlefield or operational role, and we see the soldiers as these kind of blocks, their regiments, their teams. But here, whether it's what type of work they're actually doing, maybe they're building a road, they're setting up a fort, they're getting on a ship, and as you're alluding to, when we can really find out and reconstitute their lived experiences, and then we see them as people, right? And not just, pawns on a board. This is really one of the things that can be brilliant about bringing a social history approach to military questions. So that said, Alex, just I know you've also been reading a variety of things, including a collection of essays centered on this theme that Jacob alluded to about kind of motivation. What motivates people to sign up, but also to fight when they are in these moments. And the essays, they cover a lot of different countries, types of forces, and situations. What have you taken away from this reading about why the Canadians that we're studying may have volunteered to fight in times of crisis?
As you say, the scholarship I've been looking at covers a range of time periods and theaters of war. But I'd say the key takeaway for me on combat motivation would be that there is no single easy answer for why people fight. And the context is hugely important. The time period and the nature of the war, the warfare that's taking place. So if we take the Second World War, for example, a number of the essays that are dealt with that period, some soldiers might be fighting for their regiment, others might be fighting for a kind of broader ideological ideal or for their country, for Canada. They might identify more with these broader concepts. Yet more people might just be trying to get through the day, survive the war. Yet more people might be have more personal or pragmatic reasons for taking up arms. So perhaps in times of economic uncertainty, the regular income that comes with joining the military.
Yeah, they get economic incentives. Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or perhaps even more romantic ideals about traveling the world or having
Adventure.
yes, exactly,
Yeah.
interesting experiences. So the conclusion that I came to was that you really have to take into account that complexity, right?
Mm.
How even in the same unit, in the same theater of war, uh, soldiers fighting side by side
Mm.
might have completely different motivations.
Right.
Um, yeah, and a further thing that I picked up from the scholarship was uh, the kind of power of scholarship to impact real world practical decisions made
Mm.
by policymakers, made by military leadership, which I know is within the scope of this project.
Right.
Coming up with uh, pragmatic solution, sort of
Recommendations.
recommendations
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
how to deal with reserves today.
Yeah.
So the classic example is this work published in the aftermath of the Second World War called Men Without Arms.
Mm.
And it made the rather, I suppose, interesting claim that fewer than 25% of soldiers actually fire their weapons
Right.
in battle.
Mm.
Um, and this work had a huge impact both on scholarship over the coming decades, but also in real world policymaking.
Yeah.
But more recent scholarship has highlighted how the methodology used was full of holes. This guy
Debunked a
claimed
little.
to have conducted all these interviews with people who took part in the Second World War, but it seems that many of these interviews did not take place to the extent that he claimed. So again, it's an important reminder to constantly be reevaluating your assumptions,
Mm.
taking seriously, sort of questioning existing scholarship, just to make sure that yes, as you come up with solutions for today,
Mm.
you're on firm ground, as it were. And lastly, I'll just mention how a further theme in the scholarship was the important cultural context for Canada specifically.
Right.
So Canada has a regimental system,
Mm.
which is quite distinct from conscript-based militaries like the U.S. Army, for example.
Mm.
Um, in Canada, you have regiments where there's often more than a century of tradition, of history,
Mm.
and this can be a big motivating factor and boost the morale for soldiers. And again, it's quite distinct from other militaries when you're looking at this in a comparative perspective
Yeah.
globally. Canada also has a long history of coalition warfare.
Right.
So fighting alongside allies, whether that's the British during the Normandy landings, or more recently with the Americans in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
And that also has formed Canadian military, the Canadian military experience and informed combat motivation.
Yeah.
So again, all these factors are, I think, hugely important because this question, as you say, of what motivates someone to take up arms is hugely important.
Almost as many answers as there are individuals, and people don't tend to think of Canada as a military country, and yet there is this there's warfare across our history, and Canadians being called to serve in both compulsory and voluntary ways. One of the ways that you mentioned is, that family tradition. My father was a full-time military person. I know there's a military tradition in your family,
Mm-hmm.
Jacob, and that you've been looking at serving yourself down the road. Um, and Jacob, you've also been reading about the War of 1812 in particular, and this march of the 104th Regiment, which was raised in New Brunswick and then walked from Fredericton to Kingston, Ontario, in the winter in order to garrison and provide support from American attack at that time. Not tariffs, real live bullets at that point. A very different situation. And indeed, we've seen these militias and other forces at different time periods take on long treks through the Great Lakes to get to Winnipeg, to get further into the Northwest. Um, how did people manage this? Because it seems crazy to think about now that people would go so far and in very austere conditions. And does it contribute to the sort of specific Canadian experience of conflict?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I think I'll probably start off with trying to sort of isolate what a Canadian experience and I suppose way of war
Hmm.
is. So when you look through Canadian military history, the things which really seem to crop up a lot is a sort of collaborative nature with a sort of collective aim of defending the colonies or like Dominion, especially in say in the context of the 19th century.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't until 1884 when Canadians experienced their first sort of global deployments, and even then, with the Nile expedition, it was only in really a civilian capacity. It wasn't until the Boer War where there was really a full scale military deployment to go into South Africa. And so I think that a Canadian way of war is it's something that's something that you can isolate, but not something that's necessarily wholly unique. But there was something which David Boris actually said in his most recent text, Punching Above Our Weight. He starts off his text by saying that Canadians aren't pacifists. Like
Right.
Canada is not a pacifist nation, and as you say, it's not necessarily a nation that's always associated with military triumphs or a big sort of militaristic lifestyle. But when you actually sort of get into the crux of Canadian service, there is a lot of activities occurring. But even going into what he actually means by this, I suppose you could say that it's kind of dispel the sort of ideas that, well, the Canadian military history isn't a big part of Canadian nation building.
Right.
Because obviously in the 19th century, this was, well,
Explicit.
basically, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can even back this up with some military theorists. So from like the Prussian officer Karl von Clausewitz on war, one of his sort of main theories is that war is a continuation of policy and political objectives. And in this sense, I suppose you can see this in Canada's context. And I suppose looking at, again, with the sort of databases that we were looking at and with the Red River expedition, we see people after that settling in Winnipeg and staying there for, well, I suppose, a good few decades. And if we were to look even further into the future, potentially generations.
Mhm.
So I suppose a Canadian way of war would sort of be a sort of expansionist kind of politically driven way of war, which, whilst it's again serving political means, it has a significant sort of defensive objective in the sense of this sort of expansion being, as you mentioned earlier, to repel at this point in time a threat from the southern border. But looking at the 104th Regiment of Foot and generally talking about the long, to be quite frank, horrible marches that they were doing, I think it's important to understand the sort of logistical adaptations which were taking place. So whilst this was from Fredericton to Kingston, it's a good 700 miles or so, this wasn't necessarily a contiguous march, so it wasn't non-stop. There were almost checkpoints along the way in Quebec and Montreal.
Right.
So almost taking that sort of incremental approach, I suppose, makes that long journey quite a lot easier. And this lends on to the point that I was saying about it not necessarily being wholly exclusive to the Canadian experience, because this is something which is seen in the Aroostook War of 1839 with the Maine militias. They heavily utilised sort of checkpoints and commissaries and quartermasters to almost break down marches and resupply.
It's a
for
lot
example.
of math. Right?
Oh
they
yeah,
plug it all out, yeah.
100%. But
I mean, an incremental approach will always make a big task easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's something which was taken into account, and it's, I suppose, a way of explaining these
Yeah.
long marches. But even beyond that, and going back to the sort of westward expansion, which I was alluding to, there is that sort of allure and pull of potential settlement. And this is something which we've seen pre 1867, for example, where soldiers were able to go on, say, deployments out west and settle. And even if these marches, say the one from Fredericton to Kingston, was in solid, I suppose, Canadian territory at that point in time, there's still the prospect of, I suppose, settling and bringing or starting a new life
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
some sense. But one thing which I think definitely, especially coming at this from a British perspective, which I suppose we don't necessarily appreciate due to our climate, is a kind of necessity to adapt.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure that had the St. Lawrence not frozen over, it would have been used to get to Kingston because
Right.
it's cheaper, easier, and quicker. But I suppose the harsh climate of Canada sort of forced soldiers to adapt and sort of get through, sort of get on with it and get through it.
Mm.
And again, this is something which you do see in military history, especially looking into even going quite a way back in sort of medieval military history, is people who are living in harsher climates tend to be more resilient just
Right.
because of the nature in which they've grown up in and where they fought.
Mm.
And I think that's something which can't be, I suppose, disregarded in this context, because whilst this is still fairly modern, this is a big march of, say, about 700 miles in temperatures, I think, dropped as low as minus 27 degrees Celsius, with at least one blizzard hitting them. Like, this is very, very sort of, well, these are extreme conditions, and not to normalize those conditions, but I think they were common enough to mean that soldiers had to adapt and sort of develop a stiff upper lip and just get on with it.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, maybe we can take a step back from the details of the project and kind of wrap up with a final question. I'd be curious to hear more about how this experience to date is helping you with your studies and work towards your kind of professional goals, and maybe a little bit about what it's been like to live out here in Brandon the last several weeks. Maybe Alex, you can start us off.
Sure. Well, my medium-term goal is to continue in academia and pursue postgraduate study. And the skills that I've been developing here will be hugely useful for me as I pursue that. So whether that's engaging with primary research, we have the the data set, the censuses, whether that's research skills relating to engagement with the secondary literature. I think it's been it's been very enjoyable, but I also think hugely useful for me personally
Yeah, good.
in terms of the skills that I've developed. And in terms of my impressions of Canada, well, I suppose I could say that, I mean, the sort of stereotype we have in the UK of Canadians being very nice and
Yeah.
friendly is, in my experience, absolutely true.
Oh, good.
One of my first Canadian experiences was in Toronto Airport, where I had a layover. I was in the queue about to collect my first ever Tim Hortons coffee and donut, and some stranger wished me a safe and comfortable onward journey. So that was my welcome to Canada. And then here at the university, everyone's been very welcoming, very friendly, which I'm very grateful for. So yeah, it's been I think a very successful first month, and I'm really enjoying how it's been going.
Oh, that's excellent to hear. Yeah. And Jacob, what about for you?
Um, I suppose in terms of things I'm taking away from this
Mm.
experience, in terms of skills and things, this I suppose it's an opportunity that I really can't fault in any sense because we'll say I've developed much more I suppose breadth in terms of approaches to different sources. And so for example, say we've been looking a lot at secondary literature. Um, However, there's also been quite a lot of primary sources we've been examining as well. For example, census documents, and for example, proclamations, everything, especially again going back to the Duchenne text, which we've been
Right.
looking at. Um, and so I think developing just, I suppose, more experience in using those documents as also just being around them makes you more comfortable using them. And I think I definitely have felt that in the sense of getting used to looking for certain things, um, developing, I suppose, a more streamlined approach to
Mm.
finding different pieces of information from certain bits of text. And it's also helped me sort of develop an understanding more for military history because
Mm.
whilst it's something that I do find interesting, it's not something that I've ever done in any, I suppose, professional capacity.
Right.
So having this sort of structured approach to this project has been really useful for again understanding what kinds of things you should be looking for,
Mm.
what common themes that you'll find across all, I suppose, countries, militaries, etc. And I think again that's especially important because, as you alluded to, I'm kind of looking at going into defence as a career
Yeah.
path. It's something really important to understand because I'm not someone who necessarily thinks that history rewrites itself
Mm.
or anything, but having an understanding of history means that you can, I suppose, learn from previous mistakes.
Mhm.
And especially in this military context where there is, to be honest, quite a lot of mistakes because a lot of this is quite novel.
Mm.
It, I suppose, well, I suppose for decision makers in that kind of environment, it can develop, or it can allow you to develop a greater understanding of sort of what you're dealing with. And for anyone going into that field, I think it's very useful.
Yeah.
Turning to Canada, it was definitely a change of scenery for
Mm.
me. I think just because I suppose with the sheer size
Yeah.
of Canada, and even Brandon for a city of only what 55,000 people
About
or
that.
so,
Yeah.
it's very very big,
Mm.
and there is a lot going on. So I mean, it was definitely a change of pace at first, having everything sort of spread out and having such a big area with, I suppose, not so many people about. But I found it very easy to adjust and acclimatize to Brandon, Manitoba.
Mm.
Again, everyone has been very accommodating, both inside the uni and just generally in public. I've very much felt as though I belong,
Oh, that's great.
which has been very, very pleasant and I think useful for, again, being able to hit the ground running
Yeah.
going into the project.
Yeah. Well, it's been wonderful having you both here. And, as dean, I only get a limited amount of research time each year. So to have the opportunity to really focus in, to have you help me in finding these soldiers and, compiling what we can find out about them, it's not just transcription of information, it's the analysis that you guys are doing that is helping us identify the questions, the themes, the trends, where we go from here as the project moves forward is going to move into more the 20th century and more contemporary conflicts. There's maybe more data available, more types of sources available, and yet it can still be very challenging to find real information about ordinary people and their specific experiences. So we're going to keep on that, and we're going to keep working on the policy piece and the recommendations piece as well. But we've really got a great start to this. What I hope will eventually be a book. It will no doubt take me years to write, but when you want to write a comprehensive history that covers multiple centuries, that's what it takes. And you both have been brilliant in helping me get this going. If you want to find out more about what I'm doing, you can find me on LinkedIn. And the Faculty of Arts also has a LinkedIn page, so you can find out more about what kinds of events and research and teaching and other things we're up to. And thanks everybody who tuned in. Hope you learned something today.
Bye.
Take care.